Now let's talk about the unemployment rate and examining the unemployment rate, how it's measured, how it might differ across countries and among different people. First, what does unemployment mean? Who is the unemployed? Unemployed are individuals who do not currently have a job but are actively looking for work. The actively looking part is critical. Someone who does not want a job and is not actively looking for work is not counted as unemployed. So it's only those individuals who actively are looking for work and who do not currently have a job that count as unemployed. How do we measure this? Well, we've got lots of different variables that we look at here. We've got people who are employed, which are people that have jobs, people who are unemployed, which are those that are actively looking for a job but aren't working right now. Those are counted as unemployed. If we add those two together, employed plus unemployed, we get the labor force. It's the total number of workers, whether they're actually working or not. The unemployment rate is the percentage of the labor force that does not have a job. So the unemployment rate is equal to the number of unemployed people divided by the labor force times 100. That gets us the unemployment rate. Another variable we look at is what's called the labor force participation rate. This tells us of the population 16 years and older, how many of those are members of the labor force. So we can look at the total labor force, divide that by population 16 years and over, multiply that times 100, and we get what's called the labor force participation rate. Now this varies over time. It varies for two reasons. One, our population changes, but it also varies because some people enter and exit the labor force. Even as you go through life, sometimes you're working, sometimes you're unemployed, sometimes you just might not be a part of the labor force. Now, how do we add all this up? Well, let's look at data from March of 2012. The total civilian population was over 242 million. There was about 88 million people that were not part of the labor force. They were either retired, they chose not to work, or for whatever reason were not part of the labor force. Then we had those that were employed, 142 million, plus those that were unemployed, again, those that don't have a job but are actively looking for work. That was about 12.5 million. That added up to 154.7 million people. So we can calculate the unemployment rate, which would be the number of unemployed divided by the labor force, gets us an unemployment rate in March of 2012 of 8.2%. If you look for the labor force participation rate, it's the labor force divided by the civilian population, and that would be about 64%. Now, is it the same everywhere? No, it's not. The unemployment rate changes within a country, but it also differs across countries at any point in time. Let's look at this unemployment rate across countries from The Economist in 2012. In the United States, it was 8.3%. Belgium, Sweden, Italy, France, right around the same number, between 7 and 10%. Spain, however, had a very high unemployment rate of 23%. And if we look at the low end, we had Australia, had unemployment of only 4.2%. So even at the same point in time, different countries had different unemployment rates. What else might we learn about the data if we look at it? Well, let's look at labor force participation by women. In 1948, the labor force participation rate for women 20 years and over was only 32%. By 1970, it had grown to 43%. By 1997, it had reached 60%. This trend reflected changes in our economy and society as women dramatically increased their presence in the workforce. Now, since 1997, it's remained virtually constant at 60%. What else do we look at? Well, not everybody is classically unemployed. We might look at alternative measures of unemployment and see why they're important. We could look at people that are called discouraged workers. Discouraged workers are those that have left the labor force because they could not find a job. So if you are somebody who is unemployed and actively looking for work, but you get discouraged, you might leave the labor force and stop actively looking. You're now no longer counted as unemployed. This is called discouraged workers. So if we look in March of 2012, the estimate of the number of discouraged workers were about 0.86 million. or 860,000. That's on top of the officially unemployed workers of 12.6 million. There are other marginally attached workers of about 1.5 million. And we had workers that were employed part-time that might prefer to be working full-time. That's 7.6 million. So we can easily measure, or straightforwardly measure, the officially unemployed workers. It's much harder to figure out the number of discouraged workers, marginally attached workers, and those working part-time for economic reasons. But these workers are also not really fully employed the way they would like to be, but this makes it very difficult to measure. So our measured unemployment rate are these officially unemployed workers, but we don't want to forget that there might be others that are either marginally attached or not working full-time or have just left the labor force because they've become discouraged. And finally, even at one point in time in one country, we have different unemployment rates among different segments of our population. And if we had a total unemployment rate of 8.2%, and we look at males 20 years and older, they were 7.6%. Females 20 years and over, 7.4%. If we look at teenagers, though, 16 to 19-year-olds, both genders, 25%. If we look at African American teenagers, 40.5%. So we can see that we have wide-ranging differences among experiences of different segments of our population when we look at the unemployment rate.